The sun had barely crept above the horizon when Amos Dodd realized he was going to die out here. February 1827, the Wind River Range in what would one day become Wyoming Territory. 3 feet of fresh powder had fallen overnight, and Dodd stood at the edge of a vast white wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. His cache of beaver pelts lay 15 miles south, hidden near a creek that fed into the Popo-Agie River. Without those pelts, the entire trapping season would be lost. With them, he could clear $200 at the summer rendezvous. That was 8 months of brutal work, freezing water, and constant danger. Everything rode on reaching that cache before the spring thaw. But Dodd had a problem. Every step he took, his legs plunged through the snow past his knees, sometimes past his thighs. 10 minutes of struggling through that powder left him gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd covered maybe 200 yards. At this rate, 15 miles would take days. Days he didn't have. The temperature was dropping. Storm clouds gathered on the western peaks. And somewhere out in that white expanse, a crow hunting party was working its way through the same territory. Dodd collapsed against a lodgepole pine, sweating despite the cold. This was it. 6 years of trapping in the Rockies, and he was going to lose everything because he couldn't walk through snow. But then, through the trees about a quarter-mile distant, he saw something impossible. A figure moving across the surface of the snow. Not struggling, not thrashing, moving with a steady, rhythmic pace that looked almost effortless. The figure seemed to float. Dodd squinted through the morning light and spotted 2 more figures behind the first. They were covering ground at a pace that would have been respectable even on dry summer trail. On 3 feet of fresh powder, it looked like magic. What Amos Dodd witnessed that February morning would change everything about how mountain men survived Rocky Mountain winters. The solution to an impossible problem had been perfected over thousands of years by the indigenous peoples of North America. But most white trappers were too stubborn or too proud to learn it. By the end of that day, Dodd would discover that indigenous technology could double his travel speed in deep snow while using half the energy. He would learn that the curved wooden frames laced with rawhide strips represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of survival equipment ever designed. And he would understand that his survival in the mountains depended on abandoning everything he thought he knew about winter travel. This is the story of how snowshoes revolutionized mountain man survival in the American West. It's a story about the moment when European settlers finally admitted that indigenous peoples had already solved the problems that were killing white trappers by the dozens. It's about the engineering marvel that allowed humans to walk on powder that would otherwise swallow them whole. And it's about one mountain man's desperate race against time, weather, and his own pride to learn a skill that meant the difference between wealth and death. The winter of 1826 to 1827 marked the height of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Beaver pelts commanded premium prices in eastern markets in Europe. A good pelt brought $4 to $6, and an experienced trapper could harvest 400 to 500 pounds of beaver in a season. For men willing to risk everything, the mountains represented opportunity that didn't exist anywhere else in America. But the mountains were killing them. The winter of 1822 to 1823, a party of Ashley Henry Company men wintering at the mouth of the Musselshell River found buffalo so numerous they had trouble keeping them out of camp. The abundant game saved their lives. Other parties weren't as fortunate. Cold killed trappers. Grizzlies killed trappers. Disease killed trappers. But nothing killed more mountain men than immobility in deep snow. When storm systems rolled off the Pacific and slammed into the Rockies, they dumped snow measured in feet, not inches. The Wind River Range, the Absarokas, the Tetons, these mountain ranges could receive 10 to 15 feet of snow in a single winter. For a man on foot carrying 60 pounds of gear, that snow was a death sentence. Without the ability to move, a trapper couldn't reach his trap lines. He couldn't hunt game. He couldn't flee danger. He was stuck, and in the Rocky Mountain winter, being stuck meant dying. Amos Dodd had learned this lesson the hard way. Born in 1799 in Washington County, Pennsylvania, Dodd had answered William Henry Ashley's famous advertisement in the Missouri Gazette in February 1822. Ashley was recruiting 100 men to ascend the Missouri River to its source for trapping expeditions lasting 1, 2, or 3 years. The pay was decent, the work was brutal, and the mortality rate was spectacular. Dodd signed up the next day. He'd been 23 years old and convinced he was invincible. 5 years in the mountains had taught him otherwise. He'd seen good men die from infected wounds that should have been minor. He'd watched a friend drown in spring runoff. He'd helped bury 3 trappers who froze to death when a blizzard caught them between camps. And every winter he'd experienced the suffocating helplessness of being trapped by snow. The indigenous peoples who had lived in these mountains for generations didn't have that problem. Dodd had noticed this years earlier, but had never understood why. He'd seen Shoshone, Crow, and Blackfoot hunters moving through deep snow with apparent ease, while he and his fellow trappers struggled. The white trappers had developed various solutions. Some tried to construct rough wooden platforms to strap to their boots. These contraptions usually broke within hours. Others attempted to stay in their winter camps until the snow consolidated enough to support their weight. This meant weeks of inactivity while their trap lines went unchecked and opportunities vanished. The French-Canadian voyageurs and coureurs des bois who had been working the northern regions since the late 1600s had figured it out. They'd adopted snowshoes from the Cree, Huron, and Algonquin peoples and integrated them into their standard winter equipment. But the American mountain men, arriving in the Rockies a century later, were slower to learn. Most came from regions where deep snow was rare: Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. These were not places that required specialized snow travel equipment. When mountain men hit the Rockies, they were completely unprepared for the conditions they encountered. Dodd had watched the 3 figures for 20 minutes before making his decision. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. He needed to reach his cache, and he needed help. He fired his rifle into the air, the shot echoing across the valley, and waited. The 3 figures paused, consulted among themselves, then changed direction toward him. As they approached, Dodd could see they were Shoshone, 2 men and a woman. The men carried long rifles, and all 3 wore strange wooden frames attached to their feet. The frames were perhaps 3 feet long and more than a foot wide, shaped like elongated teardrops with upturned toes. The wood was bent into elegant curves and laced with what looked like rawhide strips, woven in intricate patterns. When they reached Dodd's position, they stopped about 20 feet away. The older of the 2 men studied Dodd with an expression that might have been amusement. He said something in Shoshone that Dodd didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. "What are you doing out here without snowshoes?" Dodd tried his limited Shoshone vocabulary, mixed with sign language. He needed to travel south. He pointed. 15 miles. He had pelts cached. Important. The older Shoshone man conferred with his companions. Then he looked at Dodd's legs, which had post-holed through the snow up to mid-thigh, and shook his head. He pointed at Dodd's feet, then at his own snowshoes, and made a walking gesture. Without snowshoes, the message was clear: Dodd wasn't going anywhere. What happened next would change Dodd's understanding of indigenous technology forever. The Shoshone didn't just show him their snowshoes. They taught him. Over the next 6 hours, Dodd received an education in equipment that represented thousands of years of design refinement. The snowshoes the Shoshone wore were of the style commonly called beaver tail by later traders. The frame was made from a single strip of white ash, carefully selected for its strength and flexibility. The ash had been soaked in water for hours, then slowly steamed until it became pliable enough to bend without breaking. The craftsman who'd made these snowshoes had shaped the ash into a frame roughly 36 inches long and 14 inches wide at its broadest point, with an upturned toe that helped the snowshoe ride over the surface of deep powder. The lacing was the remarkable part. Strips of rawhide called babiche had been woven through the frame in a pattern so intricate it resembled fine basketwork. The babiche came from caribou hide, though moose and deer were also used depending on what was available. The hide had been scraped clean of all hair and fat, cut into strips about a 1/4 inch wide, then soaked until soft enough to weave. The weaving wasn't random. The center section, where the foot would rest, had a tighter weave for support. The fore and aft sections had a more open weave that reduced weight while maintaining the essential flotation. The whole structure weighed perhaps 2 pounds, but that 2 pounds of wood and rawhide could support a 200-pound man on snow that would otherwise swallow him whole. The older Shoshone man, whose name sounded like Pasuk to Dodd's ear, explained through gestures and demonstration how the snowshoes worked. The principle was weight distribution. A man weighing 200 pounds standing on boots with a surface area of perhaps 60 square inches would exert more than 3 pounds of pressure per square inch on the snow. That was enough to break through all but the most consolidated powder. But that same man standing on snowshoes with a surface area of perhaps 500 square inches would exert less than half a pound per square inch. The snow could support that. The difference meant floating on top instead of sinking to the bottom. Pasuk demonstrated the walking technique. The gait wasn't natural. Instead of the heel-to-toe rolling motion of normal walking, snowshoeing required lifting the entire foot with each step and placing it down flat. The snowshoes had to be kept slightly apart to prevent them from overlapping and tangling. The stride had to be wider than normal. The movement looked awkward at first, but Pasuk moved with fluid efficiency that suggested decades of practice. The Shoshone didn't have spare snowshoes to give Dodd. These were essential survival equipment, not trade goods, but they did something more valuable. They showed him how to make them. The younger Shoshone man had materials for snowshoe repair in his pack, strips of ash, lengths of babiche, and basic tools. The woman, who seemed to find Dodd's predicament endlessly entertaining, used these materials to demonstrate the construction process. She selected a length of ash roughly 6 feet long and perhaps 1.5 inches wide. The wood had already been prepared by steaming, and bending would have to wait for proper conditions. Instead, she showed him the lacing technique. She drilled small holes through a piece of scrap wood with a bone awl, then threaded babiche through the holes in a pattern that created a web of diamond shapes. Her fingers moved with practiced speed, pulling the rawhide tight, knotting it, moving to the next section. This wasn't craft. This was engineering. Dodd watched carefully, asking questions through gestures when he didn't understand. How tight should the weave be? Tight in the center for support, looser in the ends for weight reduction. What if the babiche broke? 2 pieces could be joined by making an incision in each and interlocking them. The joint was nearly invisible once dry. How long did it take to make a pair? A week if you had all the materials ready. Longer if you needed to harvest ash and prepare hides. The Shoshone stayed with Dodd through the afternoon. They couldn't solve his immediate problem. He still needed to reach his cache, and he still didn't have snowshoes. But they taught him something more important, the knowledge of how to solve the problem himself. As the winter sun began its descent toward the peaks, Pasuk offered an alternative solution. The Shoshone were headed to their winter camp about 8 miles west. Dodd could come with them. The camp had craftsmen who could make snowshoes. It would take several days, but it was better than attempting to struggle 15 miles through powder that would kill him before he made it halfway. Dodd accepted. Following the 3 Shoshone toward their camp, watching them move effortlessly across snow that would have been impassable for him, Dodd began to understand something that many mountain men never learned. The indigenous peoples of North America had spent millennia developing solutions to problems that white settlers treated as unsolvable. Snowshoes weren't primitive technology. They were sophisticated engineering designed for specific environments and tested across generations. The webbed snowshoe that the Shoshone, Cree, Huron, Crow, Blackfoot, and dozens of other peoples used represented a pinnacle of cold-weather survival equipment. And it worked. The history of snowshoes stretched back thousands of years before Amos Dodd struggled through Wyoming powder. Historians believe snowshoes were invented somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, probably in Central Asia. As early human populations migrated, they carried the concept with them. Groups moving west into northern Europe developed the technology into what would eventually become skis. Groups moving east across the Bering Land Bridge into North America developed it into the webbed snowshoe. North America proved to be the perfect environment for snowshoe refinement. the continent's boreal and subboreal zones, stretching from what would become New York State up through Canada to the edge of the Arctic Circle, received heavy, long-lasting snow that necessitated efficient methods of winter travel. Indigenous peoples in these regions developed not just one type of snowshoe, but dozens of distinct designs, each adapted to specific snow conditions and terrain. The Huron snowshoe, also called the beaver tail, featured a broad teardrop shape ideal for open country and rolling terrain. The Ojibwa snowshoe had a pointed front and back, making it easier to walk backward and maneuver in forested areas. The bear paw, circular and compact, excelled in mountainous terrain and dense woodland where longer snowshoes would catch on branches. The Alaskan or Yukon snowshoe stretched 6 to 7 feet long with a narrow profile and upturned nose, designed for racing across open tundra and keeping pace with dog sleds. Each design represented a solution to specific problems encountered in specific environments. The construction process was remarkably sophisticated. Frame-making was typically men's work. The craftsman would select wood carefully, usually white ash for its combination of strength and flexibility, though birch, hickory, and spruce were also used depending on availability. The wood had to be straight-grained and free of knots. A single snowshoe frame required a strip roughly 6 feet long, carefully split from a log. This strip would be soaked or steamed, sometimes for hours, until it became pliable enough to bend. The bending itself was an art. Too much force would crack the wood. Too little, and the curve wouldn't hold. The craftsman would use a form, a shaped piece of wood, or a snow-carved mold to bend the ash into the proper shape and then clamp or tie it in place to dry. For Huron-style snowshoes, the frame was made from a single piece with the ends overlapped and bound together. For Ojibwa-style shoes, 2 pieces were used, joined at the toe and tail. Crossbars were added to maintain the frame's shape, usually 2, though some designs used 4 for extra strength. The weaving was traditionally women's work, though not universally. The weaver used babiche, rawhide cut into strips roughly a 1/4 inch wide. Preparing babiche was labor-intensive. A hide had to be cleaned thoroughly, all hair and fat removed, then cut into strips using a sharp knife. The cutting technique mattered. The strips needed to be uniform in width to maintain consistent tension across the snowshoe. The babiche was soaked in water until soft and pliable, then woven while wet. As it dried, it would shrink slightly, pulling tight and creating a drum-like surface tension. The weaving pattern varied by region and craftsman, but all followed the same principle. Create a surface with enough strength to support a person's weight while maintaining flexibility and keeping weight to a minimum. Some weavers created geometric patterns of remarkable intricacy, diamonds within diamonds, hexagons, and complex arrangements that were functional and beautiful. The finest eastern snowshoes, particularly those made by craftspeople in Quebec and Labrador, featured weaving so detailed they were considered works of art. The binding system was equally important. Early designs used simple rawhide thongs that wrapped around the foot and ankle. Later refinements included heel straps and toe holes that allowed the heel to lift while keeping the toe firmly attached to the snowshoe. This pivot point was crucial. It allowed the natural walking motion where the heel rises while the toe stays planted. Without this flexibility, walking in snowshoes would be exhausting. The entire snowshoe would have to be lifted clear of the snow with each step. When French explorers first encountered indigenous snowshoes in the early 1600s, they were astounded. Samuel de Champlain, founder of Quebec, wrote in his travel memoirs in 1608 about the Huron and Algonquin snowshoes, describing them as 2 to 3 times larger than those in France, and marveling at how indigenous peoples could travel across deep snow without sinking. The French quickly recognized that survival in New France required adopting indigenous technology. French voyageurs and coureurs des bois, the fur traders who ranged across what would become Canada, integrated snowshoes into their essential equipment by the late 1600s. For them, snowshoes weren't exotic curiosities. They were survival tools as necessary as axes and knives. But American mountain men arriving in the Rockies in the 1820s were slower to adapt. Many came from southern or mid-Atlantic states where deep snow was uncommon. They had experience with cold weather, but not with sustained deep powder that lasted months. And they carried assumptions about indigenous technology that hindered their learning. Some viewed anything not developed by European or American craftsmen as inherently primitive or inferior. Others assumed that if snowshoes were truly effective, white traders would already be using them. This was circular logic that cost lives. The mountain men who did adopt snowshoes discovered a transformation in their winter capabilities. Take the journey of William Sublette and Moses Harris, two trappers who left the Great Salt Lake Valley on New Year's Day, 1827, the same winter Dodd was learning from the Shoshone. Sublette and Harris were carrying messages to St. Louis, a journey that would cover over 1,000 miles. They traveled on snowshoes, pulling a sled loaded with 50 pounds of supplies and accompanied by a single dog. The journey took them east across what would become the Oregon Trail route, through southwestern Wyoming and into the plains. For much of the journey, they walked 15 to 20 miles per day through snow that without snowshoes would have been impassable. When they ran out of firewood on the Platte River and faced nights cold enough to freeze a man solid, they kept walking through the darkness to stay warm. They reached St. Louis by March 1st, having completed one of the most remarkable winter journeys in mountain man history, made possible by snowshoes and sheer determination. Dodd's arrival at the Shoshone winter camp gave him his first real look at how indigenous peoples organized winter survival. The camp wasn't the primitive arrangement he'd expected. It was a carefully planned settlement positioned in a protected valley with easy access to water, abundant game, and enough firewood to last the winter. The lodges were arranged to provide wind protection and maximize solar heating. Food stores included dried meat, pemmican, and preserved roots and berries. This wasn't bare survival. This was sophisticated planning that allowed not just survival, but relative comfort through months of brutal conditions. The snowshoe maker Dodd was introduced to was an older man named Tsodzi. Tsodzi had been crafting snowshoes for more than 40 years. He worked in a covered area at the edge of camp where steam from a large pot kept the air warm and humid, perfect conditions for bending wood. When Dodd arrived, Tsodzi was working on a pair of snowshoes for one of the young men in the camp. The frames had already been shaped and dried. Now came the lacing. Tsodzi worked with the focused intensity of a master craftsman. He'd prepared the babiche days earlier, long strips of caribou hide soaked until pliable. He used a bone awl to create holes along the frame's inner edge, spacing them precisely by eye. Then he began weaving. The babiche threaded through the holes, crossed the frame's width, threaded through the opposite side, pulled tight, knotted. His hands moved in a rhythm developed over decades, each motion economical and precise. The pattern he created wasn't random. The center section, where the foot would rest, got a tight hexagonal weave that provided maximum support. The fore and aft sections got a more open diamond pattern that reduced weight while maintaining structural integrity. Every few rows he'd pause to check the tension, pulling harder in some sections, easing off in others, creating a surface that was taut but not rigid, strong but not brittle. Dodd watched for hours. He asked questions through a mixture of Shoshone words he'd picked up, sign language, and drawings in the snow. Tsodzi answered patiently, sometimes demonstrating the same technique multiple times until Dodd understood. This wasn't just teaching, it was preserving knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. Over the next 5 days, while Tsodzi worked on multiple projects, Dodd learned the complete process. He learned which trees provided the best wood, how to identify straight-grained ash without knots, how to split logs to get uniform strips. He learned the steaming technique, how hot the water needed to be, how long to steam the wood, how to test if it was ready by pressing gently and feeling for the moment when resistance gave way to flexibility. He learned the bending process, how to clamp the wood to a form, where to apply pressure, how to recognize when the curve was right. And he learned the weaving, that intricate process of turning dead animal hide into a load-bearing surface. Tsodzi made Dodd a pair of snowshoes. Not as payment, the Shoshone didn't operate on that kind of economy, but as a gift that carried expectations. If Dodd survived because of these snowshoes, he would remember who made them. If other trappers needed help, Dodd would remember what he'd learned. That was the exchange. Tsodzi crafted the snowshoes in the beaver tail style, about 36 inches long and 13 inches wide. He used slightly thicker ash than normal for the frame, anticipating that Dodd would be hard on the equipment while he learned proper technique. The babiche weaving was dense, more material than strictly necessary, again allowing for abuse during the learning process. The bindings were simple rawhide strips that wrapped around Dodd's boots and tied at the ankle. When Tsodzi handed Dodd the finished snowshoes, he demonstrated the proper walking technique again. Flat-footed steps, wide stance, lift the entire foot clear before setting it down. Don't shuffle. Don't drag the tails. Keep the weight balanced. Then he pointed to a cleared area outside the camp and made a walking gesture. Practice. Dodd strapped on the snowshoes and took his first step. Immediately, he understood why the Shoshone woman had found his earlier struggles amusing. Walking in snowshoes felt absurd. The wide stance made him waddle like a duck. The need to lift each foot completely clear before setting it down engaged muscles he hadn't known existed. The snowshoes tangled when he tried to walk normally, and he face-planted into the powder twice in the first 100 yards. But he didn't sink. That was the revelation. With every step, the snowshoes distributed his weight across enough surface area that he stayed on top of the powder. Where before he would have post-holed past his knees, now he sank perhaps 3 inches. The difference was transformative. After an hour of practice, Dodd's legs burned from the unusual gait, but he'd covered more distance than he could have managed in 3 hours of wallowing through snow without snowshoes. After 2 hours, the motion started feeling more natural. His muscles adapted. The wide stance became automatic. By the end of the day, he could maintain a steady pace that, while slower than summer walking, was infinitely better than immobility. The next morning, Dodd left the Shoshone camp heading south toward his cached pelts. Pa Suk and the younger man, whose name Dodd had learned was Namapai, went with him for the first few miles. They moved through the winter landscape at a pace Dodd would have thought impossible a week earlier. The snowshoes transformed the environment. Terrain that had been impassable became merely difficult. Difficult terrain became manageable. The snow was still deep, the temperature still brutal, the physical effort still exhausting. But now Dodd had a fighting chance. They covered 7 miles before noon. Pa Suk and Namapai turned west to return to their camp, and Dodd continued south alone. By evening he'd reached his cache. The pelts were where he'd left them, 60 pounds of prime beaver wrapped in oiled canvas and suspended from a tree to keep them away from scavengers. Dodd made camp, started a fire, and allowed himself a moment of profound gratitude. A week ago, he'd been convinced he would lose everything. Now, thanks to technology developed over thousands of years and the generosity of people who owed him nothing, he had a path forward. The journey back to his own winter camp took 2 days. Dodd traveled slowly, partly from exhaustion, but mostly because he was still learning proper snowshoe technique. He made mistakes. He let the tails drag, which wasted energy. He tried to step too quickly and tangled the snowshoes. He didn't pace himself properly and had to stop frequently to catch his breath. But he made it. On the evening of the second day, he saw smoke from his camp's fires and knew he'd survived. When Dodd reached the rendezvous that summer, gathering with hundreds of other mountain men at the traditional meeting place near present-day Pinedale, Wyoming, he brought his snowshoes. Other trappers examined them with interest. Some had seen indigenous peoples using snowshoes, but had never tried them. Others had attempted crude homemade versions that broke or proved ineffective. Dodd demonstrated the proper technique, explained the construction process, and shared everything Tsodzi had taught him. The adoption of snowshoes by mountain men wasn't instant or universal. Some trappers remained skeptical, convinced that real men could muscle through snow without indigenous technology. Others tried snowshoes, struggled with the learning curve, and gave up. But gradually, over the late 1820s and into the 1830s, snowshoes became standard winter equipment for mountain men operating in areas with deep snow. The transformation this created in the fur trade was significant but not obvious. There was no dramatic moment when snowshoes changed everything. Instead, there was a gradual increase in winter productivity. Trappers could check trap lines they previously couldn't reach. They could hunt in conditions that would have kept them in camp. They could travel between winter quarters when necessary, instead of being completely immobilized for months. Most important, they could respond to emergencies. If a cache needed to be moved, they could move it. If a winter camp ran short of supplies, they could travel to find more. If danger threatened, they could flee instead of being trapped. The mathematics of snowshoe effectiveness are straightforward but dramatic. A man weighing 200 pounds with a 60-pound pack would weigh 260 pounds total. Standing on boot soles with a surface area of roughly 60 square inches, he'd exert about 4.3 pounds per square inch of pressure on snow. Most powder snow can support between 0.3 and 1.0 pounds per square inch before collapsing. That means a man on boots will post hole through any snow that isn't heavily consolidated. Every step requires lifting his entire leg weight, plus the resistance of the snow compressing beneath him. In deep powder, this can mean lifting 50 to 70 pounds with each step. Walking a mile under these conditions might require the same energy expenditure as walking 10 miles on dry ground. It's not sustainable. That same man on snowshoes with a combined surface area of 500 square inches exerts only 0.52 pounds per square inch. This is within the load-bearing capacity of most snow conditions. The man still sinks, perhaps 2 to 4 inches, depending on snow quality, but he doesn't post hole. The energy required to lift his foot clear and set it down again is dramatically less. Studies conducted in the 20th century confirmed what mountain men learned through experience. Snowshoeing on unpacked snow at roughly 2 miles per hour requires about the same energy expenditure as walking on dry ground at 4 miles per hour. That means for the same effort, you can travel twice as far in the same time or cover the same distance with half the energy expenditure. For mountain men operating on survival margins, this difference was everything. It meant reaching trap lines that would otherwise be inaccessible. It meant having energy reserves when energy meant life. It meant mobility in an environment that killed immobile men. But adopting snowshoes also meant confronting uncomfortable truths. It meant admitting that indigenous peoples had developed technology that white settlers couldn't match. It meant acknowledging that survival in North America required learning from the people who'd lived here for millennia. For some mountain men, this was easy. They'd already adopted indigenous clothing, hunting techniques, and survival knowledge. For others, it was a bitter pill. They'd come west convinced of European technological advantage, and now found themselves dependent on technology they didn't invent and couldn't improve. Amos Dodd never struggled with this. He'd learned early that the mountains didn't care about pride. They killed the arrogant and the humble with equal efficiency. The only difference was that humble men learned faster and lived longer. After that winter in 1827, Dodd made his own snowshoes every fall. He never mastered the art the way Tsoudze had. His weaving was cruder, his frames less elegant, but his snowshoes worked. That was sufficient. He also began teaching other trappers. When new men arrived in the mountains without winter equipment, Dodd showed them what he'd learned. Some paid attention, others didn't. Those who didn't often paid for their ignorance with fingers, toes, or lives, lost to cold and immobility. By the 1830s, snowshoes had become common enough among mountain men that suppliers at the summer rendezvous began offering them for trade. These were usually made by indigenous craftspeople and acquired through trade networks. The quality varied enormously. The best snowshoes made by experienced craftspeople using proper materials and techniques would last for years with minimal maintenance. Poor quality snowshoes, mass-produced by people more interested in profit than quality, might break within weeks. Mountain men learned quickly to identify good snowshoes by examining the frame wood for grain quality, testing the babiche weaving for proper tension, and checking the bindings for wear points. The maintenance requirements for traditional snowshoes weren't trivial. The rawhide babiche absorbed water in wet conditions and needed regular treatment with oil or fat to maintain water resistance. Without proper treatment, the babiche would rot, especially in the wet spring snow. The wood frames needed periodic varnishing to prevent moisture damage and splitting. Broken babiche had to be replaced, a process that required carrying spare rawhide and knowing the weaving technique. For mountain men living rough in winter camps, this maintenance was another skill to master alongside all the others that meant survival. Different regions favored different snowshoe styles based on terrain and snow conditions. In the densely forested areas around the Yellowstone River, shorter bear-paw-style snowshoes were popular because they were easier to maneuver between trees. In the more open country of the Wind River Range and the Great Basin, longer beaver-tail or Huron-style shoes provided better flotation in deep powder. Some trappers owned multiple pairs, switching based on conditions, though this was expensive and meant carrying extra equipment. Most compromised, selecting a medium-length beaver-tail design that worked adequately in most situations, even if it wasn't optimal for any specific condition. The learning curve for snowshoes extended beyond just walking technique. Mountain men had to learn how to navigate steep terrain. Going uphill in snowshoes required a different technique, shorter steps, more deliberate foot placement, sometimes traversing back and forth across the slope rather than attacking directly. Going downhill was its own challenge. The natural instinct to lean back and let the heels dig in didn't work the same way with snowshoes. Many trappers learned this through painful experience, tumbling head over heels down slopes when their snowshoes caught on buried obstacles. Maneuvering in thick brush required patience and careful foot placement to avoid tangling the snowshoe tails on branches and deadfall. Crossing streams was particularly tricky because the ice thickness could vary dramatically, and falling through ice while wearing snowshoes could be fatal. The snowshoes would fill with water and become nearly impossible to remove while in the water. But despite these challenges, snowshoes fundamentally changed winter survival in the Rocky Mountains. The transformation wasn't dramatic in any single moment. There was no great revelation that swept through the mountain man community. Instead, there was a gradual, almost grudging acceptance that this particular piece of indigenous technology was essential. The men who adopted snowshoes early gained an advantage. They could work trap lines that others couldn't reach. They could hunt in conditions that kept others in camp. They could respond to opportunities that others missed. Over time, this advantage became necessary rather than optional. By the mid-1830s, attempting to winter in the high country without snowshoes was considered foolish, bordering on suicidal. The impact extended beyond just individual trappers. The major fur companies, American Fur Company, Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Hudson's Bay Company, all began including snowshoes in their standard equipment lists for winter operations. Company trappers were issued snowshoes along with their rifles, traps, and other essential gear. The companies also hired indigenous craftspeople to manufacture snowshoes specifically for trade. This created a small but important economic exchange. Indigenous peoples had a product that white trappers needed, and the companies were willing to pay for it. The best craftspeople developed reputations that extended across the mountain trade network. A pair of snowshoes made by certain individuals could command premium prices because trappers knew they'd last and perform better than mass-produced alternatives. The French-Canadian voyageurs who'd been using snowshoes for generations found themselves in demand as instructors. Companies hiring new trappers would sometimes include experienced voyageurs specifically to teach winter survival skills, including proper snowshoe technique. These informal schools taught basic competence, enough to keep men alive, though true mastery came only through experience. One winter season of actual use taught more than weeks of instruction in camp. Amos Dodd continued trapping in the Rockies until 1839, when the collapse of the beaver market made the work unprofitable. The fashion shift in Europe from beaver felt hats to silk hats destroyed the economic foundation of the mountain fur trade almost overnight. Prices that had been $4 to $6 per pound in the early 1830s fell to $1 or $2 by 1840. Simultaneously, the beaver population in the accessible areas had been trapped nearly to extinction. The combination made continued trapping financially pointless. Like many mountain men, Dodd transitioned into guiding wagon trains and supplying posts along the Oregon Trail. His knowledge of Western geography developed through years of trapping, made him valuable to settlers heading west. Dodd never forgot that winter morning in 1827 when he'd watched Shoshone hunters float across powder that had stopped him cold. He kept his snowshoes, those crude frames he'd made with Sodzi's instruction, for the rest of his life. They hung in his cabin as a reminder that survival often meant learning from people you didn't expect to teach you anything. In his later years, Dodd occasionally guided groups through winter conditions. When he did, he always brought snowshoes and always taught proper technique. He'd tell the story of watching Pasuk and Nemapai move across impossible snow, of Sodzi's patient instruction, of learning that the solution to his problems had existed for thousands of years before he arrived. The snowshoe itself continued evolving long after the mountain man era ended. The designs perfected by indigenous craftspeople remained in use through most of the 20th century, with only minor modifications. Recreational snowshoeing began growing in popularity in the late 1800s, with snowshoe clubs forming in Quebec and spreading throughout North America. These clubs organized races and winter expeditions, turning snowshoes from survival equipment into sporting gear. But the fundamental technology remained unchanged for generations because it worked. The wooden frame and rawhide webbing design represented a solution so well adapted to its purpose that improvement was difficult. Modern snowshoes, developed starting in the 1950s with materials like aluminum frames and synthetic decking, changed the weight and maintenance requirements, but not the basic principle. Weight distribution across a large surface area to prevent sinking remained the core concept. The sophisticated understanding of snow conditions, terrain types, and design trade-offs that indigenous peoples developed over thousands of years still informed modern snowshoe design. Engineers designing contemporary snowshoes studied traditional indigenous designs to understand the principles before attempting innovations. The story of how snowshoes spread through the mountain man community is ultimately a story about learning and survival. It's about the moment when European settlers confronted an environment that defeated their existing knowledge and forced them to learn from indigenous technology. The mountain men who survived were those willing to adapt, to learn, to adopt tools and techniques regardless of their origin. Those who clung to pride or assumptions about technological advantage often didn't make it. The mountains taught brutal lessons about the difference between theoretical superiority and practical effectiveness. Amos Dodd's experience wasn't unique, though his willingness to seek help rather than struggle alone perhaps set him apart from some of his contemporaries. Hundreds of mountain men made similar discoveries in similar ways, sometimes through friendly encounters with indigenous peoples, sometimes through trading posts, sometimes through other trappers who'd already learned. The cumulative effect was a gradual integration of indigenous winter survival technology into White Mountain culture. By the late 1830s, the distinctive sight of trappers moving through winter landscapes on snowshoes had become common enough that it no longer drew particular notice. The broader lesson extended beyond just snowshoes. Mountain men who paid attention learned that indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated solutions to virtually every survival challenge the western mountains presented. Methods for preserving food, constructing cold weather clothing, navigating rivers, predicting weather, finding water in arid regions, treating injuries with available plants. These, and dozens of other skills, represented accumulated knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and death. The wisest mountain men recognized this early and became students of indigenous knowledge. They learned languages, formed relationships, and absorbed whatever skills they could acquire. These men tended to live longer and prosper more than those who maintained distance and assumptions. The transformation snowshoes created in winter travel capabilities cannot be overstated. Before their adoption, mountain men in deep snow country were effectively immobilized for months at a time. After their adoption, winter became another season requiring different techniques, but not fundamentally different from summer in terms of mobility. This meant trap lines could be worked year-round in some regions. It meant winter camps could be positioned based on factors other than just getting trapped wherever you happened to be when the snow got too deep. It meant emergencies could be addressed rather than endured. It meant, quite simply, that survival odds improved dramatically. For indigenous peoples who'd been using snowshoes for millennia, the sight of white trappers finally adopting this technology must have been both amusing and inevitable. The question was never whether white settlers would learn to use snowshoes. The question was how many would die before they figured it out. Some indigenous groups shared their knowledge freely. Others were more guarded, recognizing that helping white trappers survive meant more competition for game and resources. The Shoshone who helped Dodd that February morning made a choice to share knowledge, despite uncertain benefits to themselves. That choice saved Dodd's life and indirectly helped dozens of other trappers who learned from him. The engineering sophistication of traditional snowshoes deserves recognition that it rarely receives. These weren't crude implements fashioned from available materials. They were refined products of iterative design development spanning generations. Every curve of the frame, every pattern in the webbing, every detail of the binding system represented solutions to specific problems identified and addressed over centuries. The upturn on the toe prevented the snowshoe from diving beneath the snow with each step. The narrowing toward the tail provided tracking stability while minimizing weight. The tighter weave in the center supported foot pressure, while the looser weave in the ends reduced unnecessary material. The slight flexibility in the frame absorbed impact while maintaining structural integrity. Modern engineers analyzing traditional snowshoe design recognize it as remarkably well optimized given the materials and manufacturing techniques available. The craft knowledge required to make quality snowshoes wasn't easily acquired. It took years to develop the eye for selecting proper wood, the touch for steaming and bending without breaking, the skill for maintaining consistent weaving tension. Master craftspeople like Tso represented repositories of accumulated knowledge that couldn't be transferred through simple observation. Dodd's snowshoes worked, but they never approached the quality of those Tso made because Dodd lacked decades of experience. This reality meant that even as mountain men learned to use snowshoes, they remained dependent on indigenous craftspeople for the best examples. That dependence created economic opportunity, but also illustrated the limits of knowledge transfer. By the time Amos Dodd died in 1867, snowshoes had become so standard in northern climates that their indigenous origins were often forgotten or ignored. White manufacturers in Canada and the northern United States produced snowshoes commercially, employing techniques learned from indigenous craftspeople but marketed as white innovation. This pattern of adopting indigenous technology while erasing or minimizing indigenous contribution repeated across numerous areas. The snowshoe became identified as generic northern equipment rather than specifically indigenous engineering. Modern snowshoeing enthusiasts might never learn that the equipment they use descends directly from technology developed by Cree, Huron, Algonquin, Shoshone, and dozens of other indigenous peoples. The simple truth remains. Snowshoes let Amos Dodd travel through winter snow twice as fast while using half the energy. That transformation meant the difference between death and survival, between losing a season's work and salvaging it, between helplessness and mobility. The simple trick wasn't simple at all. It was sophisticated engineering refined over thousands of years. It was accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. It was practical wisdom that white settlers desperately needed and indigenous peoples possessed. And it was, for mountain men willing to learn, the key to surviving Rocky Mountain winters. The story of snowshoes in the mountain fur trade represents an exchange of knowledge between indigenous peoples and European settlers. Indigenous peoples shared their expertise. White trappers learned techniques that had been refined over thousands of years. In that specific moment, when Amos Dodd stood knee-deep in Wyoming powder and watched Shoshone hunters demonstrate technology he desperately needed, there was a transfer of knowledge that saved a life. Tsodzi's patient instruction gave Dodd the skills to survive. Pasuk and Nimapai's willingness to help a stranger created the opportunity for that learning to occur. The snowshoes themselves, elegant solutions to the problem of winter travel in deep snow, represented one of humanity's most successful examples of adapting to challenging environments. And the fact that mountain men finally recognized this technology's value, however belatedly, demonstrated that survival ultimately trumps pride for those who want to keep living. Today, when modern hikers strap on aluminum-framed snowshoes with synthetic decking, they're using equipment that descends directly from the wooden frames and rawhide webbing that saved Amos Dodd's life in 1827. The principle hasn't changed. The physics haven't changed. The fundamental insight that distributing weight across a larger surface area prevents sinking into snow, that insight has remained constant across thousands of years. The sophistication of traditional snowshoe design, developed without CAD software or materials science laboratories, stands as testament to what human ingenuity can accomplish through observation, experimentation, and generational knowledge accumulation. Amos Dodd's story reminds us that the people we least expect to teach us something often possess the knowledge we most desperately need. The indigenous peoples of North America had solved problems that white settlers treated as unsolvable. They'd developed technologies that white traders dismissed as primitive, and they'd accumulated wisdom that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone willing to learn. The mountain men who figured this out early survived and prospered. Those who didn't often died preventable deaths, killed not by the mountains, but by their own inability to recognize that solutions existed if they'd just ask for help. That lesson remains relevant long after the mountain fur trade ended. Survival, whether in wilderness or in life generally, requires recognizing what you don't know and learning from those who do.